Grand Prix Prague. Hello and welcome to the semi-finals here at Grand Prix Prague. Tim Willoughby alongside Hall of Famer Frank Karsten calling all of the action as we now get down to our final four. We can see Ondřej Stráský, the top finisher in the Swiss portion of this tournament, just looking on at his opening hand here. Bant Spirits against Hardened Scales, and on the play he gets to lead things off with a Noble Hierarch, which will enable everything else to come a little bit thicker and faster from the Spirit side of things. But the Hardened Scales deck once again has Hardened Scales on turn one, and that means big plays coming in the future from Larry Pispa's side of things.
Yeah, without Hardened Scales, it is far too easy for the deck to just be a bunch of 1/1s with mediocre abilities. But with Hardened Scales, all of the cards are twice as powerful, and that will give Laurie lots of explosive power. Meanwhile, Ondřej also had a reasonable start with Noble Hierarch on turn 1. He was thinking for a bit, and he never looks particularly happy when he's in the tank, whether to go for Hierarch or the Mausoleum Wanderer on turn 1. In general, when in doubt, just go for the mana acceleration first.
Yeah, Stráský carefully figuring out what he wants to do in this game, because with Hardened Scales in play, almost anything that Pispa does for the rest of this game is going to be very potent indeed. And I don't believe that there's any way in the main deck, at least, that Stráský is going to be able to get rid of that enchantment.
Yeah, I think Stráský is deciding between either progressing his board this turn by indeed adding the Wanderer and the Supreme Phantom to the battlefield, or keeping mana up and passing the turn with Spell Queller mana. The thing is, if you just pass your second turn with 3 mana up, then Laurie is unlikely to play any of his best spells into the Spell Queller. Whereas by going for the Mausoleum Wanderer and the Supreme Phantom, you put down the biggest clock. This will maximize his damage output over the course of the next few turns. And then you still have the Spell Queller left over to disrupt Pispa's plans on turn number 3.
And there's some nice disruption available to Ondřej Stráský here in subsequent terms. He does have access to Path to Exile as well as a copy of Spell Queller that you've mentioned. But Pispa, with an unusual draw here, looks to have 3 copies of Hardened Scales at his disposal. How important is it to get the second and indeed third copies of it in play?
Second and third one, I mean, it's still useful. It will help you a little bit, but not as important as the first one.
Stráský.
Although, I guess when you have, let's say, 3 Hardened Scales on the battlefield, any artifact that you sacrifice to Arcbound Ravager gives +4/+4, so can get out of hand pretty quickly. I would be surprised to see this Steel Overseer living a turn cycle. Stráský has Path to Exile in hand. He doesn't necessarily have to play it right now. He can wait until Pispa's upkeep. But I would expect him to use that card to prevent some of the Hardened Scales madness from going on. Oh, not yet. He might also be waiting for something more impactful, like a Walking Ballista or a Hangerback Walker, because the Steel Overseer by itself doesn't quite do much yet.
Ancient Stirrings. Pispa digging a little bit deeper, looking for one of the creatures that is a big payoff there. There you can see the Masterpiece version of Steel Overseer. Another Steel Overseer among the options available to Pispa here on the top of his deck, but also a Hangerback Walker. If you wanted to go deep on making this deck look pretty magnificent, there's Masterpieces of a lot of the key artifact creatures available to it. Arcbound Ravager. Now this might well meet a response from Stráský.
He does have Spell Queller, so the obvious play is to just put that Spell Queller onto the battlefield, effectively countering the Ravager, and keep going with attacks in the air. But I think Stráský is trying to figure out whether he, might need to go for it already. He might also want to keep the Spell Queller perhaps for something that he deems more impactful. Cards like Walking Ballista might be more dangerous to face for his deck.
I mean, My slight concern with doing that, even though obviously there are other cards that can get pretty scary, is that the turns that he doesn't spend his mana and get more threats on the board, he's potentially not got enough damage coming through in the air that he's really pressuring Peacebar's life total all too much.
Also, you have to think about what you're going to do with the Path to Exile before sacrificing that Flooded Strand. Given that he searched for a basic, I would expect that he is now planning to Path to Exile the Steel Overseer at the end of turn. Apparently not. Then I would have expected him to fetch a dual land, but that's all okay. Oh no, was one of the Hierarchs still summoning sick? Well, probably.
Okay, so big swings here from a team of spirits. Mausoleum Wanderer being pumped by a spirit having come into play this turn. All of these spirits being pumped by the big spirit lord there. So this, a sizable attack in the air. And I guess, at least for now, that Steel Overseer, it's not doing enough that Andre pulling the trigger on removing it.
So I count 8 power worth of flying in the air, which means that Andre currently does not have a lethal attack on the next turn, giving Pispa some additional time. Also the addition of that Inkmoth Nexus and maybe the life gain ability of Phyrexia Score can buy him even more time. And speaking of Phyrexia Score, that will get much better when Hangerback Walker would enter the battlefield, because between a 2/2 Hangerback Walker and a Steel Overseer activation, Lori could potentially grow it to a 4/4 and then sacrifice it to Phyrexia Score to, effectively generate 4 Thopters.
Yeah, those Thopters, a big old roadblock for a lot of what Stratsky's spirits are doing here.
Although if Pispa would go for that particular play, I would expect Stratsky to respond to a Steel Overseer activation by pathing the Hangerback Walker.
A lot of discipline being shown by Stratsky here in the use of his removal spell.
Just making sure what it does. Well, sacrifice any artifact, gain a life, but it's not so much about the life gain as it is about the sacrifice ability. Because that Hangerback Walker, it's not doing all that much as a 2/2 on the table, but all of those Thopters it can generate, those will be useful.
So, in response to a Path to Exile, of course, Pispa can sacrifice the Hangerback Walker to generate 2 flyers. Looks like Stratsky content to allow this activation of the Overseer.
He's very patient with that Path to Exile.
And a Spirit off the top here does represent a lethal attack, and a Drog Skull capped in the pickup. So every spirit being pumped, Mausoleum Wanderers being pumped twice.
Yeah, so the Wanderers are 4/4 currently this turn.
It's going to be a huge attack.
Oh, it will be. Even 4 Thopters may not be enough to stop it. I mean, obviously you can jump block and survive, but Pispa would like to not only survive but also deal with some of the opposing creatures. That may be difficult though.
Everybody's coming in.
Well, Pispa can sacrifice the Hangerback Walker here still. Path to Exile won't be able to prevent that because sacrifice is going to be a cost. And then yeah, he can go for the quadruple jump. He might go for the quadruple block on, I guess, Supreme Phantom. But no, that you cannot do that because then you die to the other attackers. I mean, Spell Queller is 4/4. Mausoleum Wanderers are 4/4. I don't really see great blocks. Even the Supreme Phantom, a 2/4.
Spellcaller actually a 4/5, meaning that even the quad block won't be enough to deal with it. So Pispa instead taking a chunk of damage here and blocking the 2 Mausoleum Wanderers. This way around, he's left with a few creatures that he can make larger.
Yeah, those Thopters could grow to 3/3 creatures. That's of course still pretty sweet, maybe even bigger with hardened scales, but at some point you may just not have enough blockers to survive. Laurie currently has Nexus and 2 Topters, so that's 3 flying blockers. You can make them super big by also playing additional hardened scales, but he is facing 5 attackers, which are, well, 2 power at least. So that means that unless something changes, I don't see a way for him to survive this turn. He does have a walking ballista. That can definitely change some things. Strasky's still holding that path to exile.
Yeah, the path to exile. At this point, if I'm Larry Pispa, I don't think that I could believe that he's still got it in hand, because it is one of those cards that there's been ample targets for it over the course of this game, and I think both of us at this point would have pulled the trigger on it.
Yeah.
Quick update on our other table. Tiomeri already a game up with his humans list against the Ironworks combo. So much disruption available to those humans. And we saw Thiago Saporito doing good work with humans against Ben Stark in the Pro Tour. Not too surprised to hear that first game going to humans.
Something to keep in mind with the walking ballista is that, well, Drogskull Captain, it does give all of the other spirits hexproof. Itself, it doesn't have hexproof, but Pispa will have to get rid of the Drogskull Captain before he can target any other spirits with the walking ballista.
Yeah, that's quite a costly endeavor as well.
Now ballista, he can cast it just for Axis 1. Thanks to hardened scales, will be a 3/3. Then a Steel Overseer activation, turn it into a 6/6. Actually, Pispa chose, it looks like, not to go for the maybe that hardened scales is still on the stack, and Strasky is finally pulling the trigger on Steel Overseer.
As it turns out, this kind of a prescient move, because obviously the follow-up card was going to be problematic, but this way around, a lot fewer counters being thrown around before this Steel Overseer goes off on a little journey.
And if that is indeed the case, then Strasky would try to avoid a scenario where he is facing, let's see, 4/4 Topters. Saying, well, I can deal with 3/3 Topters, but if that hardened scales resolves, they're going to be too big as a blocker. Now Pispa has to do the math, seeing if maybe he needs to well, activate his Inkbond Nexus right now to boost it with Steel Overseer while he still can, in order to have access to it as a bigger blocker on the next turn. But I think if he tries to line up 3 flying blockers for all of Andre's attackers, given that each of them is at least 2 power, I don't think he can activate his Nexus here. He just has to rely on the walking ballista somehow. Although I'm not sure that's going to be enough when Steel Overseer is no longer around.
This has been a nice game from Andre Strasky here. The draw from Pispa has been pretty good, but at least thus far, Andre the one that's putting on all the pressure.
I mean, both of these decks are doing what they were designed to do. Pispa has hardened scales with some of his key artifact creatures, whereas Strasky had a pretty solid draw, starting with a Hierarch, lots of cheap spirits, and 2 lords, plus some disruption. So a perfect mix of pressure, curve, and disruption for Strasky. Might indicate that Band Spirits isn't as far behind in this matchup as Laurie Pispa's victory in the quarterfinals had made me believe.
It looks like there might just be some confusion about the number of counters on these Thopters. It seemed pretty clear that all of that got done with hardened scales on the stack. I mean, they both clearly put 2 counters on there.
Which would be the correct number.
Yeah.
It looks like the judge is just verifying that all of that is indeed in order.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure which other way it could play.
Meanwhile, I will call that Bond Spirits was one of the best performing decks in Day 2. It was only about 2% of the Day 2 metagame, but it put 2 people in the top 8. So this is arguably the breakout performance for that archetype. It didn't take long after the printing of Supreme Phantom for people to realize the power of a deck that is somewhat similar to humans, in the sense that it also relies on tribal synergies and some disruptive elements, but has the advantage of, well, flying, for instance, but also a better sideboard, which we might see sometime later in this match.
A 3/3 Walking Ballista, awkwardly sized when it comes to dealing with the spirits on the other side of the battlefield here.
And it can shoot down the Drog School Captain, which is currently 3/3, pumped by the Supreme Phantom. But let's see. Yeah, then Andre still has 4 flyers, each of which... Oh no, that's not true. Laurie can actually leave Supreme Phantom and Mausoleum Wanderer unblocked and fall down to 1 life. Okay.
But for the fact that there's another Lord on top, that enough for the cards to get scooped up. Andrei Stratsky taking game 1 there against Larry Pispa. Pispa, if anything, a few too many copies of Hardened Scales and not enough to go alongside them.
Yep, and Andre, this is just his tournament. He's always finding the cards on top of his deck when he needs them.
So let's have a little look at these deck lists and see if we can figure out how some sideboarding might go here. There are a number of really interesting cards in Andrei Stratsky's sideboard here. I mean, Stony Silence seems like it's got a lot of strong applications. That much is kind of obvious.
Yes, when I'm looking at his sideboard, I see 3 copies of Stony Silence and 12 other cards that are maybe also nice, but those seem to be absolutely the key in this matchup.
Well, I mean, one that seems interesting to me, and tell me how you feel about this one, is Worship. So there is the potential for Stratsky's deck to create an army that is hexproof, that cannot in any way be targeted by the opponent. So if you get, for example, Drogskull Captain ×2, which potentially is achievable with Phantasmal Image, likewise if you get a Geisterstrand Traft in play, then you have a deck with which, if it has Worship in play, it's going to have a creature in play that's going to be very difficult to remove, and then no way of the other side to be able to finally deal that final point of damage.
It is an interesting angle, but personally I would not go for it for several reasons. First being that Laurie Pispa has Inkmold Nexus in his deck, so he can set up an Infect kill, which gets around the Worship effect. Second of all, I would expect Laurie to bring in some copies of Nature's Claim as a defense against Sony Silence. That also gives him an out to Worship. And third, you did give a good point that 2 Drog School Captain or maybe Guys of Saint Draft, that's kind of safe. Worship plus a hexproof creature is a nice combo. But if Andre has Worship plus a bunch of non-hexproof creatures, then Laurie can easily set up a Walking Ballista, which just gets ridiculously big by combining Steel Overseer and Hardened Scales, and gun down all of Andre's creatures, leaving him with essentially a naked Worship. So I'm still just mainly looking at these 3 copies of Stony Silence, which I think are going to be key in this matchup, because they shut down all of the key cards from Laurie.
Alrighty, well, let's have a look on the other side of things to see what Larry can potentially bring in here, because there are a number of spells, including that Nature's Claim, that could be kind of interesting.
Even though Nature's Claim is not great against Andre's main deck configuration, sure, there's Ether Vial to target, but that by itself is not important enough. You do often see that these decks bring in at least some copies of Nature's Claim as a hedge against Stony Silence. Otherwise, if it comes down, you just lose immediately. Now, general affinity decks often don't bring in such enchantment hate against Stony Silence because, well, if the enchantment lands, Mox Opal Springleaf Drum cannot be activated anymore and it's hard to even cast it. But this is a deck that has lots of forests, way more than you might see in a regular affinity deck. So even after Stony Silence comes down and shuts down the Mox Opal, can still reasonably cast a Nature's Claim. Other cards in Laurie's sideboard that might be interesting are, well, Dismember. It's a way of breaking up some of the tribal synergies that Andre has, and having a Dismember at the ready for what is arguably the best card in Andre's deck in Spell Queller. That'll also be a nice way to get ahead, a bit of a tempo card that will also help your key spells resolve. I don't think Laurie is going to be relying too heavily on Welding Jar. Andre's deck is not filled with removal spells, and the ones that he has in Path to Exile, yeah, Welding Jar cannot even protect against it.
All right, so some relatively small adjustments, but very important ones, especially in the case of the Battle of the Stony Silence. Nature's Claim on one side, Stony Silence on the other. If that key enchantment stays in play, it'll be a big deal. Let's head back to the match and see which side ends up victorious. Of course, Andrei Stradsky already a game up, and worth noting that Stradsky coming into this tournament, he was considering moving in a different direction, maybe taking a bit of a break from Magic, just playing the more local events to him. And he said, Grand Prix Prague, this might be my last tournament for a little while, unless I win.
That is indeed what he tweeted out a while ago. And of course, we already see people quoting that tweet saying, well, this tweet aged well.
Yeah, of course.
But it is still a bit too early to call that.
One more game he needs to win here, and then the whole finals as well against whoever it may be. We know that it's Tomeri already a game up against Cloud Schmidt. I don't really know which matchup the Bant Spirits deck prefers to play against in the finals. There's obviously quite wildly different strategies at play between those two decks.
I think Andre would like to play the most against Ironworks. If I just take a look at the sideboard again, I mean, it's just filled with nearly 15 hate cards against Ironworks, ranging from Stony Silence, Rest in Peace, Damping Sphere, even Thalia. It looks like he will be ready for that particular matchup.
All right, well, that, of course, putting the cart before the horse a little bit. He still needs to get past Larry Pisper if he's going to advance to that finals, whoever it may be against. These players just finishing their shuffling here, having made their adjustments, and once they're in the top 8, these guys do have access to deck lists, so they will be working with full information, and that could easily change the way that this match goes compared to if it had been in the Swiss.
For sure. It means that Laurie, for example, knows how valuable his Nature's Claims are going to be. If you play against an unknown deck, yeah, you know, you can never be sure if they have Stony Silence or Ether Vial, which is somewhat of an unusual card to play in the Bant Spirits deck. Seeing the deck list means that Laurie knows that the value of those cards are well, a bit higher than maybe on average.
You can see behind Pisper there a number of his countrymen all supporting one another, hoping that Pisper can make it all the way through. And indeed, I believe I also spied them checking out the coverage a little bit on their phones. The best view that you can get, even if you're stood right next to the match, right where you're sat right now.
So it looks like a mediocre hands for both players. Laurie just has a whole lot of lands and not all that much action, whereas
no
Andre
lands at all for Osdre.
Yeah, does not have the lands.
Yeah, if these guys shuffled their hands together, drew a random 7 from between them, they would probably both be happier than with what they currently have with their full grip of 7.
Although Laurie's hand is still reasonable, I think. If I see it correctly, and I'm just trying to spot cards based on tiny fragments of card images, he has Animation Module into Walking Ballista and Mox Opal, which, while definitely not among the best draws his deck can generate, there's no hardened skills in particular, is still reasonable. It gets some of his synergies online. Mox Opal is, of course, a card that makes all of his draws much better. and it looked like he did decide to keep it.